The bitter November wind cut through the broken windows of Lincoln High School like a blade, carrying with it the acrid smell of industrial decay and forgotten hopes. Pete Rose, no relation to the baseball legend, though he'd endured countless jokes about it, stood at the front of his chemistry classroom, watching his students filter in for what everyone knew would be their final semester together. The fluorescent lights above flickered with the irregular rhythm of a dying heartbeat, casting uneven shadows across the worn linoleum floor where silver duct tape formed a patchwork of repairs that spoke to decades of deferred maintenance. At 52, Pete had devoted 28 years of his life to teaching in Detroit's most challenged district, and the toll was written in every line of his weathered face. His once dark hair had turned completely gray. His shoulders carried the permanent stoop of someone who had spent countless hours hunched over student papers, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion that came from fighting a system that seemed designed to crush hope rather than nurture it. The school building around him told the same story: crumbling walls, leaking ceilings, and textbooks older than some of his students. "All right, settle down," Pete called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from nearly 3 decades of classroom management. The chatter died down gradually, replaced by the familiar sounds of Lincoln High, the distant clang of pipes, the wheeze of an ancient heating system, and the rhythmic dripping from a ceiling stain that had been there since Pete's first day teaching. "I know you've all heard the rumors circulating through the hallways, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. Yes, they're true. The district is officially closing Lincoln at the end of this academic year." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft thud of a textbook hitting the floor as someone's grip loosened in shock. Pete looked out at the faces before him, 23 students who represented the last generation to walk these halls, kids who had already been dealt more than their share of disappointments, but who still showed up every day hoping that education might be their ticket to something better. Marcus Williams, 17 years old, with eyes that held more wisdom than most adults possessed, slowly raised his hand. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor that betrayed the emotion he was trying so hard to suppress. "Mr. Rose, what about the science fair? What about our project? We've been working on it for months." Pete's heart sank like a stone. For the past 4 months, he'd been working with a dedicated group of his most ambitious students on an innovative water purification system designed specifically to address Detroit's ongoing water crisis. The project represented everything he believed education should be: relevant, impactful, and transformative. More importantly, it was these kids' golden ticket to college scholarships and a future that extended far beyond the economic devastation that had gripped their community for decades. The water crisis in Detroit wasn't just a news story to these students, it was their daily reality. Many lived in homes where the tap water ran brown or carried the metallic taste of lead pipes. Their families spent precious grocery money on bottled water, and everyone knew someone whose health had been affected by contaminated drinking water. When Pete had first proposed the water purification project, he'd expected moderate interest. Instead, he'd discovered a passion and urgency that had transformed his classroom into something resembling a research laboratory. "The state science fair is still scheduled to proceed as planned," Pete replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "But without proper funding for materials and equipment, without access to the advanced testing facilities we need—" He didn't need to complete the sentence. They all understood the implications. The project that had consumed their after-school hours, their weekends, their dreams, it was as good as dead. The silence stretched until Keisha Johnson, whose single mother worked 3 jobs just to keep their families' heads above water, slumped forward in her desk chair. "So, that's it then?" Keisha's voice was barely above a whisper. All those hours we spent researching contamination patterns, all those calculations for optimal filtration rates, all those plans for helping our community. Not necessarily, Pete heard himself saying, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. We still have time. We still have each other. Maybe we can figure something out. As the final bell rang and students shuffled out with the defeated posture of people who had been let down one too many times, Pete remained at his desk, staring at the stack of bills that had arrived in that morning's mail. His mortgage was 3 months behind. His 15-year-old Honda needed repairs he couldn't afford, and his wife Sarah had been picking up double shifts at the hospital just to keep them treading water financially. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, trying to help his students solve Detroit's water crisis while drowning in his own sea of financial problems. The afternoon sun, filtered through the grimy windows of Lincoln High, cast long shadows across the empty classroom. Pete looked around at the space that had been his second home for nearly 3 decades, noticing details he'd somehow stopped seeing. The periodic table poster that was missing half its elements, the chemistry equipment that belonged in a museum, the student artwork that had been covering the same bulletin board for 5 years because there was no money for fresh supplies. But there were other details too, more meaningful ones. The thank you notes from former students who had gone on to college, to careers, to lives that their circumstances had never seemed to make possible. The photographs of successful graduates who still came back to visit, who credited Pete with believing in them when no one else would. The science fair ribbons and certificates that represented not just academic achievement, but proof that kids from Lincoln High could compete with anyone when given the chance. That evening, Pete sat at his kitchen table in his modest home in Oak Park, a suburb that had seen better days, but still maintained a stubborn dignity. The house itself told the story of a teacher's life. Small but well-maintained, filled with books instead of expensive furniture, decorated with student artwork rather than professional pieces. Sarah moved around their tiny kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce, a meal that had become far too familiar in their household as their budget grew tighter each month. "How was school today?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. "They're definitely closing Lincoln," Pete replied, rubbing his temples where a persistent headache had taken up residence. "And the kids? Sarah, you should see how devastated they are. They've put everything into this science project. It's not just a school assignment to them, it's their chance to prove to the world that Detroit kids are just as smart and capable as anyone else." Sarah sat down across from him. Her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from another 12-hour shift at Detroit Medical Center. At 48, she still carried herself with the grace and determination that had first attracted Pete during their college years, though the stress lines around her eyes had deepened considerably over the recent months. She studied her husband's face with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotional state. "Pete, I know that look in your eyes. I've seen it before, and it usually means you're about to do something that will either be incredibly noble or incredibly stupid. Whatever you're thinking, we can't afford it. The second mortgage payment is due next week, and I honestly don't know where it's going to come from. But what if this is their only shot?" Pete's voice grew passionate, the way it always did when he talked about his students. "Marcus could get into MIT with this project. His understanding of chemical processes is intuitive in a way that can't be taught. Keisha's got the kind of analytical mind that could revolutionize environmental engineering if she just had the opportunity to develop it. And Tony, despite all the chaos and trauma he deals with at home, he's got an understanding of chemistry that I've rarely seen in 30 years of teaching. And what about us?" Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of decades of marriage to a man whose generosity often exceeded his common sense. "What about our future? "We're not getting any younger, Pete. Your pension won't be enough to support us, especially if they close the school and affect your benefits. We need to think about our own retirement, our own security." Pete knew she was absolutely right, but he couldn't shake the image of his students' faces when he'd essentially told them their dreams were over. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house creak and settle around them, his mind racing with possibilities and calculations. How much would the advanced materials cost? Where could he possibly find that kind of money? What were the real chances that 3 teenagers from Detroit could accomplish something that would change their lives? The next morning brought no relief from his internal struggle. Pete arrived at Lincoln early, as had been his habit for 28 years, and found Marcus already in the chemistry lab, hunched over their project materials with the focused intensity of a scholar. The early morning light filtering through the dirty windows cast him in silhouette, making him look older than his 17 years. "You're here early this morning," Pete observed, setting down his coffee, a small luxury he'd been rationing lately to save money. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus replied, without looking up from the water contamination charts spread across the lab table. "I keep thinking about the water samples we collected from different neighborhoods around the city. Mister Rose, the contamination levels in some areas are even worse than what made the national news during the Flint crisis. People are drinking this every day, cooking with it, giving it to their babies. Marcus, I need you to understand something important. The materials we need for the advanced filtration components alone would cost over $15,000. The testing equipment to verify our results would be another $8,000. The school district doesn't have that kind of money. They don't have any money." For the first time that morning, Marcus looked up, his eyes bright with the kind of determination that reminded Pete exactly why he'd become a teacher in the first place. "Mr. Rose, my little sister won't drink water from the tap because she's scared of what might be in it. She's 8 years old and she's afraid of water. My grandmother died last year from complications that the doctors said might have been related to long-term lead exposure. This isn't just about winning a science fair or getting into college. This is about saving lives in our community." The weight of responsibility settled on Pete's shoulders like a lead blanket. These weren't just his students. They were the future of a community that had been written off by too many people for too long. These were kids who had grown up surrounded by evidence that the system had failed them, yet they still believed that education and hard work could make a difference. During his lunch break, Pete found himself in the school's library, a space that had been stripped of half its books due to budget cuts, researching the costs of the specialized materials they would need. The numbers were staggering. Beyond the basic filtration components, they would need access to a clean room environment for testing, specialized measuring equipment that cost more than Pete made in 3 months, and enough materials to build multiple prototypes for testing and refinement. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mortgage company called again. They want to discuss our options. Can you call them back today?" Pete closed his laptop and walked to the windows overlooking the school's courtyard. Once this space had been filled with gardens maintained by the biology classes, a small oasis of green in an urban environment. Now weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, graffiti covered the walls, and broken bottles glittered in the corners where the wind had blown them. But if he squinted and used his imagination, he could still see the potential, just like he could see the potential in his students. That afternoon, during his planning period, while other teachers graded papers or prepared lessons, Pete made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd been avoiding for months, his heart pounding as he waited for someone to answer. "First National Bank, this is Jennifer speaking. How can I help you today?" "Hi, this is Pete Rose. I'd like to inquire about refinancing my home to access some equity." The conversation that followed was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Yes, they could potentially refinance. Yes, there was enough equity in the house to cover what the students needed, but yes, the risks were enormous, especially given his age and employment situation. Mr. Rose, I have to ask, what do you need this money for? Most people refinance for home improvements or debt consolidation. Pete hesitated, trying to find words that would make sense to someone who had never stood in front of a classroom, who had never seen the spark of possibility in a student's eyes, who had never understood that sometimes the most important investments couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Educational expenses, he said finally, for my students. 2 weeks later, Pete found himself sitting in the cramped office of a loan officer, surrounded by stacks of paperwork that represented his entire financial life laid bare like an autopsy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical persistence, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow over documents that would either secure his student's future or completely destroy his own. The air smelled of industrial carpet and desperation, a scent he was becoming all too familiar with. Mr. Rose, I have to be completely honest with you, said Jennifer Martinez, the loan officer who looked young enough to be one of his former students. Her professional demeanor couldn't quite hide her concern as she reviewed his financial documents. Your debt-to-income ratio is concerning, and with the announced school closure, there's no guarantee of continued employment. Refinancing for this amount would put your home at significant risk of foreclosure. Pete shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white. I understand the risks, and I appreciate your honesty. But this is important, more important than you could possibly understand. Can I ask what exactly you need $40,000 for? In my experience, people don't usually refinance their homes for educational expenses, especially not teachers approaching retirement age. Pete looked out the small window at the parking lot where his aging Honda sat among newer, shinier vehicles. How could he explain that he was mortgaging his family's security for a group of teenagers that most of society had already written off? How could he make her understand that these kids represented hope in a city where hope had become a rare and precious commodity? My students are working on a water purification project that could genuinely help solve Detroit's water crisis. They need specialized equipment and materials to complete their research and compete at the state science fair. If they succeed, they'll have opportunities for college scholarships and futures they never thought possible. Jennifer's expression softened slightly, but her professional duty remained clear. Mr. Rose, I have to advise you that this is an extremely risky financial decision. If you're unable to make the payments, and given your employment situation, that's a real possibility you could lose your home. Are you prepared for that possibility? I understand the consequences. And your wife, is she supportive of this decision? Pete thought about the conversation he would need to have with Sarah that evening, about the papers he would need to bring home for her signature. She will be. That evening, Pete sat across from Sarah at their kitchen table, the refinancing documents spread between them, like a chasm that threatened to divide their marriage. Sarah's evening coffee had grown cold in her hands as she read through the terms and conditions, her expression growing more concerned with each page. Pete, this is absolutely insane. We're risking everything we've worked for over the past 25 years. Sarah, you didn't see Marcus today when I told him we might be able to get the materials they need. That kid literally started crying, not tears of joy, but tears from someone who's never had adults believe in him before. These aren't just my students, they're kids who have been failed by every system that was supposed to support them. But what about our retirement? What about that trip to Europe we've been saving for since we got married? What happens if you can't find another teaching position after Lincoln closes? Pete reached across the table and took her hands, feeling the calluses from her years of nursing work, the wedding ring that had grown loose as she'd lost weight from stress. Do you remember why I became a teacher in the first place? Because you wanted to make a difference in kids' lives. And have I made a real difference sitting in classrooms year after year, following scripted curricula designed by people who have never taught, preparing kids for standardized tests that don't measure anything that actually matters in life? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the man she had married, the idealist who had somehow survived nearly 3 decades in a system designed to crush idealism. These kids aren't our responsibility, Pete. We don't owe them our future financial security. Maybe not legally, but morally. Sarah, I've been teaching for almost 30 years, and I've never encountered a group of students with this much potential working on something this genuinely important. If we don't help them, if I don't help them, who will? They'll graduate, if they're lucky, and work minimum wage jobs for the rest of their lives, and all that potential will be wasted. The next morning, Pete arrived at school to find not just Marcus in the lab, but Keisha and Tony as well. The sight of them huddled around their research materials at 7 in the morning, an hour before classes officially began, reminded him that he wasn't the only one making sacrifices for this project. Keisha was hunched over a borrowed laptop, running complex calculations, while Tony carefully measured chemical compounds with the precision of a professional chemist. Mr. Rose! Keisha looked up, her eyes bright with an excitement that made her look younger than her 16 years. I've been researching patent applications for water filtration systems all night, and I think our approach is completely unique. If this works, if we can prove it works, we're not just talking about winning a science fair. We're talking about something that could actually be manufactured and distributed to help communities dealing with water crises. Tony, usually the quietest member of their group, spoke up with unusual animation. My dad knows someone who works at the Ford plant in Dearborn. He says they're always looking for new technologies, especially ones that could help with environmental issues. If we could get their attention, if we could show them what we're developing. Pete felt his heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. These kids weren't just dreaming anymore. They were building a realistic vision of their future, and he was about to bet everything he owned on their ability to make that vision a reality. During his lunch break, Pete called the bank and completed the electronic signature process that would seal his family's fate. $40,000 would be deposited into his checking account within 2 business days. The monthly payments would stretch his family's budget far past the breaking point, but it would give his students everything they needed to complete their project and compete at the highest level. That afternoon, he gathered Marcus, Keisha, and Tony in the chemistry lab after the final bell had rung and the hallways had emptied of students. I have an announcement to make, Pete began, his voice steadier than he felt. We're going to complete this project. We're going to build the best water purification system that high school students have ever created. Mr. Rose, we really appreciate the encouragement, but without proper funding for materials, Keisha started. We have funding. The silence that followed was so complete that Pete could hear the ancient radiator clanking in the corner, the distant sound of traffic on the street outside, the whisper of wind through the broken window seal. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. How? Did the district suddenly find money they didn't know they had? No, the district didn't change their minds about anything. But sometimes when something is important enough, you find a way to make it happen. Pete spent the next hour outlining their timeline with military precision. They had exactly 18 weeks until the state science fair competition. The first phase would involve purchasing and assembling the basic filtration components, which would take approximately 4 weeks. Phase 2 would focus on testing and refinement, requiring another 8 weeks of intensive work. Phase 3 would be preparing their presentation and building a demonstration prototype that could actually be operated in front of judges the final 6 weeks before competition. Mr. Rose, Tony said quietly, his analytical mind already working through the implications. This is going to cost a tremendous amount of money. Equipment, materials, testing supplies. Where is it all coming from? Pete looked at these three young people who had become the center of his universe, who represented everything he believed education could accomplish when it was allowed to focus on real problems and real solutions. Don't worry about the money. That's my responsibility. Your responsibility is to build something that will change the world, and I mean that literally. As the students packed up their materials for the day, chattering with an excitement Pete hadn't heard in months, he remained alone in the empty classroom. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities made visible. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah at the hospital. "It's done," he said simply. "The refinancing went through? Everything. We're completely committed now. There's no turning back." Sarah's sigh was audible through the phone connection. "Pete, I really hope you know what you're doing." "I hope so too. But Sarah, if I'm wrong about these kids, if this project fails, at least I'll know I took the chance. I'd rather lose everything trying to do something meaningful than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible." That weekend, Pete spent Saturday morning at a specialized scientific supply company in Ann Arbor, placing orders that made his stomach churn with anxiety. $15,000 for the advanced filtration membranes that would be the heart of their system. $8,000 for the testing equipment they would need to verify their results. Another $12,000 for the materials needed to build multiple prototypes for testing and refinement. With each purchase, he felt the weight of his decision settling deeper into his bones, but he also felt something else. A sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Sunday evening found Pete and Sarah sitting on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the Detroit skyline in shades of orange and purple. The neighborhood around them showed the signs of economic hardship. Several houses with "for sale" signs that had been there for months, yards that were overgrown because people couldn't afford lawn care, the general air of a community that was struggling but hadn't given up hope. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah broke the comfortable silence, "about making a difference." Pete waited, unsure whether he was about to receive support or an ultimatum that would force him to choose between his marriage and his students. "I remember when you first started teaching, fresh out of college, full of ideas about changing the world. You would come home every day with stories about your students, about the breakthroughs they were having, the connections they were making between what they were learning and their real lives. Somewhere along the way, those stories stopped coming. The system wore me down," Pete admitted. "Standardized testing, budget cuts, administrative bureaucracy that seemed designed to prevent actual teaching. It all just became about survival, about getting through each day without losing my mind. But that's changed now, hasn't it?" Pete considered the question carefully, thinking about the energy he felt when working with Marcus, Keisha, and Tony, the sense that they were engaged in something genuinely important. These three kids. Sarah, they're not just academically gifted, they're brilliant in ways that can't be measured by standardized tests. And more than that, they care about something bigger than themselves. When was the last time you met teenagers who were willing to spend their weekends in a chemistry lab working on a solution to their community's water crisis? Never, Sarah admitted. "If I don't help them now, if I don't give them this chance, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what they could have accomplished, and I'll know that I had the opportunity to make a real difference in the world and chose not to because I was afraid of the financial risk." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of 25 years of marriage, of shared dreams and weathered storms. Okay. Let's risk everything we own on these kids. But Pete, they better be worth it, because we're betting our entire future on their success." Monday morning brought the first delivery of materials, and Pete arrived at school early to sign for packages that represented more money than he'd ever spent on anything except their house. As he wheeled box after box into the chemistry lab on a borrowed dolly, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded him of his very first day as a teacher 28 years earlier. Marcus was waiting for him in the hallway, having somehow convinced the security guard to let him into the building before official hours. "Is that it? Is that all our equipment?" "This is some of it. The rest will arrive throughout the week." Marcus began opening boxes with the enthusiasm of a child on Christmas morning, carefully examining each component with a reverence that Pete found deeply moving. "Mr. Rose, I can't believe this is really happening. Just 2 months ago, I was seriously thinking about dropping out of school and getting a job to help my family with rent. Now, I'm working on something that could actually help people." As Pete watched his student examine the sophisticated filtration membranes with the careful attention of a scientist, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. The financial cost was terrifying. The risk to his family's security was enormous, but the potential, both for these kids and for the community they were trying to help, was immeasurable. The question now was whether 3 teenagers from Detroit could accomplish what established scientists and engineers had been struggling with for decades, and whether a 52-year-old teacher had just secured their future or completely destroyed his own. 6 weeks into the intensive phase of their project, the chemistry lab at Lincoln High School had been transformed into something that bore more resemblance to a professional research facility than a typical high school classroom. The walls were covered with charts tracking contamination levels from water samples collected throughout Detroit. Mathematical calculations that stretched across multiple whiteboards and prototype designs that had evolved through dozens of iterations. Multiple filtration systems in various stages of completion occupied every available surface, creating an organized chaos that spoke to the intensity of their work. The constant hum of testing equipment had become the soundtrack of their days, punctuated by the excited voices of students who had discovered the addictive nature of genuine scientific discovery. Pete arrived each morning at 6 a.m. and rarely left the school before 8 in the evening. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened to the point where colleagues had begun asking if he was ill, and he'd lost nearly 20 pounds from a combination of stress and the habit of forgetting to eat when he became absorbed in the project. But watching his students work with the focus and dedication of graduate-level researchers made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. More than that, he was witnessing something he'd never seen in nearly 3 decades of teaching. Students who had taken complete ownership of their learning, who drove the research forward with an intensity that exceeded his own. "Mr. Rose, we have a significant problem," Keisha announced during their after-school work session, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been grappling with a technical challenge for hours. She stood before a whiteboard covered in calculations and diagrams, her expression troubled but determined. "What kind of problem are we dealing with?" "The filtration rate is too slow for practical application. At our current rate, it would take approximately 6 hours to produce 1 gallon of clean water. That might be acceptable for emergency situations, but it's not practical for addressing the daily water needs of families or communities." Marcus looked up from the prototype he was carefully assembling, his hands steady despite the complexity of the work. "What if we tried to increase the surface area of the filtration membrane? We could design a system with multiple filtration chambers working in parallel." "We'd need completely different materials for that approach," Tony replied, consulting the detailed notebook where he recorded every aspect of their experiments. "The membrane we're currently using was specifically chosen for its contaminant removal efficiency, not for high-volume flow rates. The 2 requirements might be mutually exclusive with our current design." Pete felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. They had already spent $35,000 of the $40,000 from the refinancing, and now they were discovering fundamental limitations in their approach. How much would new materials cost us? Keisha consulted her laptop, where she maintained a comprehensive database of suppliers and pricing. Approximately $8,000 for the high-flow membranes, plus another $3,000 for the additional testing equipment we'd need to verify performance. But Mr. Rose, there's no guarantee this approach will work. We might need to try several different configurations before we find something that meets both our efficiency and flow rate requirements. The weight of the financial implications hit Pete like a physical blow. $11,000 more than they had available, with no guarantee of success. That evening, he sat in his car in the school parking lot for nearly an hour, staring at his bank statement on his phone screen. The refinancing money was nearly gone. They weren't even close to having a working prototype, and he still hadn't found another teaching position for the following year. He thought about calling Sarah, but he knew exactly what she would say. They couldn't afford to spend another dollar, and maybe it was time to accept that they had done everything they could. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus that made his heart race. "Mr. Rose, I've been researching all night. I think I found a solution, but it's complicated. Can we meet early tomorrow morning?" The next day, Marcus presented his research with the thoroughness and sophistication of a graduate student defending a thesis. He had identified a revolutionary filtration material that was not only more efficient than what they were currently using, but also significantly less expensive. The material had been developed by a startup company in California that was trying to break into the water purification market. "There's one significant challenge," Marcus explained, his presentation thorough and professional. "The company doesn't sell directly to individuals or schools. They only work with certified research institutions and established corporations. But I took the initiative to contact them and explain our project in detail." "And what was their response?" "They're interested, but they want to see our preliminary results and have a video conference with our lead researcher." Marcus paused, looking directly at Pete. "That would be you, Mr. Rose." Pete felt a surge of pride mixed with pure terror. "Marcus, I'm just a high school chemistry teacher. I'm not a professional researcher with advanced degrees and published papers." "No, but you know more about water chemistry than anyone I've ever met, including my uncle, who's an environmental engineer. And more importantly, you believe in this project enough to—" Marcus paused, as if a realization was dawning on him for the first time. "Mr. Rose, where exactly is all this money coming from? The school district definitely doesn't have this kind of budget, and teachers don't make enough to personally fund research at this level." Pete had been dreading this conversation for weeks, knowing that eventually his students would piece together the financial reality of their situation. These were intelligent kids who understood that the sophisticated equipment filling their lab represented a substantial investment. "The specific source of funding isn't what's important right now," Pete began, but Keisha's voice interrupted him. "Mr. Rose." Her tone was gentle, but absolutely firm. "We're not children, and we're not stupid. We understand that the school doesn't have money for this kind of equipment. We know that teachers are underpaid and often have to buy basic supplies with their own money. So where is $40,000 worth of scientific equipment coming from?" Pete looked at these three young people who had become like his own children, who trusted him completely, who had no understanding of the enormous risk he was taking on their behalf. "I refinanced my house," he said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a confession. The silence that followed felt endless. Tony was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mortgaged your house for our science project. You risked losing your home so we could build a water filtration system." Marcus's voice carried a mixture of awe and horror. Keisha started crying. Not the dramatic tears of a teenager, but the quiet, overwhelmed crying of someone who suddenly understood the magnitude of an adult's sacrifice on her behalf. "Mr. Rose, we can't let you do this. What if our project doesn't work? What if we fail? What if you lose your house because you believed in us?" "Then I'll lose it for something worthwhile," Pete replied with more conviction than he felt. "But we're not going to fail. We're going to build something that matters, something that helps people, something that proves Detroit kids can accomplish anything when they're given the chance." The video conference with the California company was scheduled for the following Friday, giving Pete exactly 1 week to prepare for what felt like the most important presentation of his life. He spent every spare moment reviewing their research, practicing his explanations of their methodology, and trying to project the confidence of someone who belonged in the same conversation as professional engineers and scientists. Sarah helped him set up proper lighting in their dining room and borrowed a high-quality camera from a colleague at the hospital. The night before the conference, she sat with him at the kitchen table, helping him organize his presentation materials. "You know what you're doing," she said, her voice carrying the reassurance he desperately needed. "You've been teaching chemistry for 30 years. You understand this subject better than most people with fancy degrees." Friday evening arrived with the weight of everything they had worked for hanging in the balance. Pete sat before his laptop screen in their dining room, facing 3 engineers from Advanced Filtration Technologies who looked impossibly young and sophisticated. His students crowded around behind the camera, their faces tense with anticipation. "Mr. Rose, we've had a chance to review the preliminary data you sent us, and we have to say we're quite impressed with your approach," said Dr. Lisa Chen, the lead engineer whose voice carried both authority and warmth. "However, we do have some concerns about the scalability of your design and the long-term sustainability of your filtration method." For the next hour and 15 minutes, Pete found himself engaged in the most intense technical discussion of his career. The engineers asked detailed questions about contamination removal rates, long-term membrane degradation, cost-effectiveness of materials, and potential manufacturing scalability. His students occasionally whispered suggestions or corrections, which he incorporated seamlessly into his responses, creating a collaborative dynamic that impressed the professional engineers. "One more question, Mr. Rose," Dr. Chen said as the conference was winding down. "This is clearly sophisticated work. What's your educational background in filtration technology?" "I don't have formal training in filtration technology," Pete admitted. "I'm a high school chemistry teacher, but these students and I have been teaching each other, learning together, researching together. When you're working on something you truly care about, you find ways to master whatever knowledge you need." The call ended with a promise that they would hear back within a week. Pete closed his laptop and looked at his students, feeling like he had just completed the most challenging exam of his life. That weekend brought a mixture of hope and mounting financial pressure. Pete received another call from the mortgage company requesting updated employment information, and Sarah got news that her hours at the hospital might be reduced due to budget cuts. "Pete, I'm scared," Sarah admitted as they sat on their front porch Sunday evening, watching their neighbors struggle with their own economic challenges. "If this doesn't work out, if the students don't win the science fair, if there's no licensing deal, we're going to lose everything. I keep thinking about what happens if you can't find another teaching job, if my hours get cut further, if any unexpected expense comes up." Monday morning brought news that changed everything. Pete arrived at school to find an email from Dr. Chen waiting in his inbox, and his hands actually trembled as he opened it. The subject line read, "Partnership Opportunity, Advanced Filtration Technologies." "Mr. Rose," the email began, "after extensive discussion with our engineering team, we're impressed not only with your technical approach, but with the educational methodology you've developed. We'd like to propose a partnership that goes beyond simply providing materials." Pete read the email 3 times before he fully understood what was being offered. the company wanted to provide not just the materials they needed, but also technical support, access to professional testing facilities, and most importantly, a pathway to patent protection and potential commercialization if their prototype proved successful. "There is one condition," the email continued. "We'd like to document this entire process as a case study in innovative STEM education. If you're agreeable, we'd like to send a small film crew to document your students' work and potentially use this project as the foundation for an educational outreach program we're developing." Pete sat staring at his computer screen, hardly believing what he was reading. Not only would this partnership solve their immediate material needs, but it offered something far more valuable: validation that what they were doing mattered beyond just their small community. When he shared the news with Marcus, Keisha, and Tony that afternoon, their reaction was a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "They want to make a documentary about us?" Keisha asked, her voice carrying wonder. "More than that," Pete explained. "They want to learn from what we're doing here. They think our approach to combining real-world problem-solving with rigorous scientific methodology could be a model for other schools." But we haven't even finished the project yet," Tony pointed out with his characteristic analytical caution. "What if our prototype doesn't work? What if we fail in front of cameras?" "Then we fail honestly, and we learn from our mistakes," Pete replied. "But I don't think we're going to fail. I think we're about to accomplish something extraordinary." The next few weeks passed in a blur of intensive work, punctuated by visits from engineers and filmmakers who documented every aspect of their research process. Pete watched his students rise to the occasion, explaining complex concepts to professionals, defending their methodology with confidence, and demonstrating a level of scientific thinking that impressed everyone who observed their work. But the pressure was also mounting. The State Science Fair was now just 8 weeks away, and they still didn't have a fully functional prototype. The new materials had arrived and proved to be everything Dr. Chen had promised. The flow rate issues were completely resolved, and the filtration efficiency had actually improved, but integrating all the components into a working system that could be demonstrated reliably was proving more challenging than any of them had anticipated. "Mr. Rose, I think we need to talk about backup plans," Marcus said one Friday afternoon as they cleaned up the lab after another day of troubleshooting. "What kind of backup plans? What happens if we don't win at the state level? What happens to the partnership with the California company? What happens to you?" Pete had been asking himself the same questions, but had avoided discussing them with his students. The partnership agreement was contingent on their project receiving recognition at the State Science Fair. Without that validation, the company would have no obligation to continue their support. "We're going to succeed," Pete said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "But what if we don't?" Keisha pressed. "Mr. Rose, we know you risked everything for us. We know your house, your future, everything depends on this project working out. That's a lot of pressure to put on 3 teenagers." "Dick." That evening, Pete sat in his car in the school parking lot for over an hour, unable to face going home and pretending everything was fine. His phone rang, and Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Pete, where are you? Dinner's getting cold." "I'm still at school, just thinking." "About what?" "About whether I've made the biggest mistake of my life." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Pete, come home. We need to talk." When Pete finally arrived home, he found Sarah waiting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers spread out before her. "I've been doing some research," she said without preamble. "I know you're worried about the science fair, about whether the kids will succeed, about what happens to us if they don't. Sarah, I'm terrified. What if I've bet everything on a dream that can't come true? Then we'll deal with the consequences together, just like we always have. But Pete, I want you to look at something." She handed him a folder containing printouts of emails, letters, and documents he'd never seen before. "What is this?" "Letters from your former students. I've been tracking them down, contacting them through social media, asking them about the impact you had on their lives." Pete opened the folder and began reading. Letter after letter from students he'd taught over the years, describing how his classes had inspired them to pursue science careers, how his belief in them had given them confidence to attempt things they never thought possible, how his teaching had literally changed the trajectory of their lives. "Maria Gonzalez is now a biochemist at Johns Hopkins," Sarah said, pointing to one of the letters. "She wrote that your chemistry class was the first time she believed she was smart enough for college. David Thompson is an environmental engineer in California. He says your classes taught him that science could be used to solve real problems in communities like the one where he grew up." Pete read through letter after letter, his eyes filling with tears as he realized the long-term impact his teaching had made on dozens of students over the years. "Pete, even if this project doesn't work out the way we hope, you've already made a difference in more lives than most people ever touch. Marcus, Keisha, and Tony, regardless of what happens with the science fair, they're different people because of what you've taught them. They believe in themselves in ways they never did before. But the money, our house, our future, we'll figure it out. We always do. But I won't let you second-guess the most important work you've ever done." The next Monday brought a breakthrough that changed everything. Tony arrived at school early with a solution to the integration problems that had been plaguing their prototype for weeks. Working over the weekend with insights from the California engineers, he had redesigned the filtration chamber configuration to eliminate the flow bottlenecks that had been reducing their system's effectiveness. "Mr. Rose, I think we've got it," he announced as Pete arrived at the lab. "The new design not only fixes the flow problems, but it actually improves the filtration efficiency beyond what we originally projected." For the next week, they ran test after test, documenting performance that exceeded every benchmark they had set for themselves. The system could process contaminated water at a rate of 8 gallons per hour while removing 99.98% of heavy metals, bacteria, and organic contaminants. The cost per gallon of clean water would be approximately 25 cents, making it economically viable for communities dealing with water crises around the world. "We're ready," Keisha announced after reviewing their final test results. "We have a working prototype, we have documented proof of its effectiveness, and we have a presentation that explains not just what we built, but why it matters." But Pete could see something in his students' faces that concerned him, a mixture of excitement and terror that mirrored his own emotions. They had accomplished something extraordinary, but now they had to prove it to judges who would determine not just their academic success, but the financial future of their teacher's family. The stakes had never been higher, and the most important test of their lives was just 3 weeks away. The package containing their final materials arrived on a Monday morning that felt charged with the electricity of impending change. Pete signed for the delivery with hands that had developed a persistent tremor. Not from cold, despite the brutal February wind that cut through Detroit like a scythe, but from the accumulated stress of months spent walking a financial tightrope with no safety net below. The box contained precision instruments that represented their last, best hope of proving that 3 teenagers from Detroit could compete with anyone in the world. Marcus, Keisha, and Tony had arrived at Lincoln High over an hour before the first bell, their faces pressed against the frosted windows of the chemistry lab as they watched the delivery truck navigate the pothole-scarred street. Pete had never seen teenagers so genuinely excited about scientific equipment, and their enthusiasm served as a constant reminder of why he had risked everything for this moment. "Is that everything? Do we finally have all the components we need?" Keisha asked as Pete carefully wheeled the package into their makeshift laboratory. "This should be the last delivery," Pete confirmed, though he held his breath until they had inventoried every item against their checklist. Doctor. Chen included the final calibration equipment and some additional testing protocols that should help us document our results with absolute precision. As they carefully unpacked the contents, Pete marveled at the sophistication of the instruments they now had access to. The precision flow meters looked like something from a university research facility. The computerized monitoring system could track dozens of variables simultaneously, and the new filtration membranes appeared almost identical to their previous materials, but promised revolutionary improvements in both efficiency and durability. "Mr. Rose, look at this," Tony said, his voice filled with wonder as he examined the technical specifications. "According to these documents, the new membrane material has a variable pore structure that can adapt to different types of contaminants. It's like having an intelligent filter that thinks about what it's removing." The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of intensive work that transformed their chemistry lab into something resembling a professional research and development facility. The students spent every available moment refining their prototype, running exhaustive tests, and documenting results with the thoroughness of experienced scientists. Pete watched his students develop not just technical expertise, but the kind of professional confidence that typically took years to acquire. But the pressure was beginning to show on all of them. Keisha had developed a persistent cough from the long hours spent in the poorly ventilated lab, often staying until Pete physically escorted her out of the building. Marcus had lost noticeable weight and frequently fell asleep during his other classes, his teachers reporting that he seemed completely absorbed in some project that consumed all his mental energy. Tony's grades in subjects other than science had begun to slip, though his understanding of advanced chemistry concepts had progressed to a level that amazed even Pete. Pete himself wasn't faring much better. The increased mortgage payments had forced him and Sarah to eliminate every non-essential expense from their budget. They had cancelled their cable television, stopped eating at restaurants entirely, and postponed necessary car repairs that grew more urgent each week. Pete had lost 25 pounds and developed a nervous habit of constantly checking his phone for messages from creditors, grant opportunities, or any news that might affect their precarious financial situation. But their prototype was not just working. It was exceeding every expectation they had dared to establish. The filtration system they had built could process contaminated water at a rate of 12 gallons per hour, significantly faster than their original projections. More importantly, their testing revealed contamination removal rates of 99.99% for heavy metals, bacteria, viruses, and organic pollutants. The cost per gallon of purified water had dropped to 18 cents, making their system economically competitive with any commercial filtration technology on the market. "Mr. Rose, we need to have a serious conversation," Keisha said one afternoon as they finished analyzing their latest batch of test results. "What's concerning you? The performance data looks exceptional." "That's exactly the problem. Our results are too good. We've run these tests over 30 times now, and we're consistently getting performance numbers that exceed anything I can find in published research literature. What if we've made some fundamental error in our methodology? What if our testing procedures are flawed? We'll look completely foolish at the state science fair." Marcus nodded emphatically. "I've been losing sleep over the same concern. Our system appears to be outperforming filtration technologies developed by major corporations with unlimited budgets and teams of PhD-level engineers. How is that possible?" Pete understood their anxiety completely. Extraordinary success could be just as frightening as failure, especially when the stakes were as high as they had become. "What do you think we should do?" We need independent verification from someone with unquestionable credentials, Tony replied immediately. We need a real scientist to examine our system and confirm that our results are accurate and our methodology is sound. Pete's heart sank as he considered the implications. Independent testing would require resources they didn't possess, and more importantly, it would mean exposing their work to outside scrutiny from experts who might not understand or appreciate the context of their achievement. That evening, Pete found himself staring at his phone for nearly an hour before finally gathering the courage to call Dr. Chen in California. He explained their situation and their desperate need for professional verification of their results. Mr. Rose, I have to tell you, the performance numbers you're describing are genuinely remarkable, Dr. Chen replied, her voice carrying both excitement and professional skepticism. If your results are accurate, you and your students have developed something that could have significant commercial applications throughout the developing world. Could you recommend someone in the Michigan area who might be willing to provide independent testing services? Actually, I have a much better suggestion. I'm scheduled to attend a conference at Wayne State University next week. Would it be possible for me to visit your laboratory and examine your system in person? I'd like to see this work firsthand. Pete felt a mixture of excitement and absolute terror. Having a legitimate scientist examine their work was exactly what they needed for credibility, but it also meant their project would be subjected to professional scrutiny for the first time by someone with the expertise to identify any flaws in their approach. Dr. Chen arrived the following Thursday, navigating her rental car through the maze of construction zones and abandoned buildings that surrounded Lincoln High School. Pete met her in the parking lot, acutely aware of how the school's deteriorating facade and graffiti-covered walls must appear to someone accustomed to pristine university research facilities. Dr. Chen, thank you so much for making this trip. I should warn you that our laboratory isn't exactly what you might consider state-of-the-art. Dr. Chen, a compact woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and an encouraging smile, surveyed the neighborhood with genuine interest rather than the judgment Pete had feared. Some of the most innovative work I've encountered has come from people operating with limited resources. Necessity often drives creativity in ways that unlimited budgets cannot. When they entered the chemistry lab, Pete's students were waiting with nervous anticipation. They had spent hours cleaning and organizing their workspace, but there was no concealing the water stains spreading across the ceiling tiles, the duct-tape tears in the linoleum flooring, or the creative electrical arrangements needed to power their sophisticated equipment in a building never designed for such demands. Dr. Chen, these are my research partners, Pete said, making formal introductions. Marcus Williams, Keisha Johnson, and Tony Rodriguez. For the next 3 hours, Dr. Chen subjected their system to the most rigorous examination Pete had ever witnessed. She tested their water samples using her own portable equipment, reviewed every aspect of their documentation with forensic attention to detail, questioned their methodology with professional thoroughness, and conducted several independent tests using calibrated instruments she had transported from California. Throughout the process, Pete's students responded to her questions with remarkable confidence and precision. They explained not only what their system accomplished, but demonstrated deep understanding of the underlying chemistry, the engineering principles involved, and the broader applications their technology might enable. They discussed technical challenges they had overcome, design iterations they had tested and rejected, and theoretical improvements they were considering for future development. I need to ask you something that might seem unusual, Dr. Chen said, as she carefully packed her testing equipment. How did high school students develop this level of expertise in advanced filtration chemistry and engineering design? We've been completely immersed in this project for months, Marcus explained. Mr. Rose has been teaching us things that aren't covered in any high school textbook, challenging us to understand concepts at a level we never thought we could reach. And we've been reading graduate-level research papers, watching university lectures online, corresponding with researchers around the world, essentially creating our own advanced curriculum, Keisha added. Plus, we've been learning from each other, Tony contributed. When you're working with people who are just as passionate about the project as you are, you push each other to understand things more deeply. Dr. Chen turned to Pete with an expression that combined professional respect with genuine amazement. Mr. Rose, what you've accomplished here represents something extraordinary. Not just the technical achievement, though that's remarkable, but the educational transformation you've facilitated. These students are performing analytical work at a graduate level while demonstrating practical problem-solving skills that many PhD candidates never develop. Pete felt warmth spreading through his chest, the first genuinely positive emotion he had experienced in weeks. They've exceeded my expectations every single day. I've never worked with students who were more dedicated, more intellectually curious, or more willing to push themselves beyond what they thought was possible. There's something else I need to discuss with all of you, Dr. Chen continued, her tone becoming more businesslike. My company is very seriously interested in this technology. If you're open to exploring the possibility, we'd like to discuss a formal licensing agreement that would provide substantial funding for further development and, more importantly, guarantee full college scholarships for all 3 students. The silence that followed was broken only by the familiar sound of water dripping from the persistent ceiling leak that had plagued their lab all year. Pete looked at his students and saw hope and disbelief struggling for control of their expressions. What kind of funding would be involved? Pete asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the racing of his pulse. Initially, we're prepared to offer $75,000 for development and patent protection costs, plus royalty payments based on any commercial applications we develop. Additionally, we're prepared to guarantee full 4-year scholarships to any accredited university, with strong engineering programs for all 3 students, plus summer internship opportunities at our California facilities. That evening, Pete sat in his car in the school parking lot for over an hour, calling Sarah with news that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Pete, are you absolutely certain about this? They actually want to license the technology and provide college scholarships? Sarah, it's completely real. Dr. Chen sent me preliminary agreements before she even left Detroit. The funding would be enough to pay off our mortgage completely and still have money remaining for the students' additional college expenses. For the first time in months, Sarah's voice carried unrestrained excitement. Pete, I am so incredibly proud of you. You believed in these kids when absolutely nobody else would. You risked everything we own to give them a chance, and you were right. They've accomplished something that will change their lives forever. But even as Pete allowed himself to feel genuine hope for the first time since this journey began, he understood that they still faced one crucial hurdle. The state science fair was now just 2 weeks away, and they would need to present their work to judges who might not be as receptive or knowledgeable as Dr. Chen. The licensing agreement, the scholarship offers, everything they had worked toward was contingent on their project receiving formal recognition at the state level. More importantly, Pete had learned through hard experience not to celebrate any victory until it was absolutely guaranteed. Too many things had gone wrong in his career and in his students' lives for him to assume that success was inevitable, regardless of how promising their current situation appeared. As he drove home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Pete realized that regardless of what happened at the science fair, something fundamental and permanent had changed. His students had discovered that they were capable of extraordinary achievements when challenged appropriately and supported adequately. He had rediscovered his passion for teaching and his belief in education's power to transform lives. Together, they had proven that remarkable things could happen when adults were willing to invest genuinely in young people's dreams and potential. But the most important test still lay ahead of them, and everything they had worked for would be decided in just 14 days. The Michigan State Science Fair occupied the entire exhibition hall of the Grand Rapids Convention Center, a cavernous space that seemed specifically designed to make individual projects feel insignificant against the vastness of human knowledge. Pete and his students arrived on Friday morning, 2 days before judging would officially begin, hauling their carefully packed prototype and display materials through corridors that echoed with the nervous energy of hundreds of young scientists preparing to present their life's work. Marcus, Keisha, and Tony moved with controlled urgency as they unpacked their meticulously transported filtration system in the space they had been assigned. Months of intensive work had been compressed into a display that would need to communicate their entire story in just a few minutes of interaction with judges who would determine not only their academic recognition, but the trajectory of their future lives. The pressure was enormous, but Pete could observe the quiet confidence his students had developed through their collaboration with Dr. Chen, and the validation that came from knowing their work had genuine commercial value. "Mr. Rose, look at what we're competing against," Keisha whispered, gesturing toward the elaborate displays surrounding their modest setup. "Some of these projects have equipment that costs more than most people's cars." Pete surveyed the competition and had to acknowledge that it was genuinely impressive. Projects sponsored by major corporations like General Motors and Pfizer, students from elite private academies with unlimited research budgets, investigations conducted in partnership with major universities that provided access to equipment he had only seen in scientific journals. Their humble presentation from Lincoln High looked distinctly modest by comparison. "Sophisticated equipment doesn't win science fairs," Pete replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced by his own reassurance. "Innovation, understanding, and the ability to solve real problems, those are the qualities that win science fairs." Tony was methodically connecting their filtration system to the display's power supply, his movements precise and confident despite the intimidating environment. "Mr. Rose, I need to ask you something that's been keeping me awake at night. What happens if we don't place in the top 3? What happens to the licensing agreement with Dr. Chen's company? What happens to you and your family?" It was the question Pete had been dreading, but knew was inevitable. Dr. Chen had been completely transparent that her company's interest was contingent on the project receiving state-level recognition. A licensing agreement with high school students who hadn't proven themselves in serious competition represented too much risk for corporate investment, regardless of the technical merits of their work. "We're going to succeed," Pete stated with more confidence than he actually felt, "because what we've built isn't just an academic exercise or a science fair project. It's a practical solution to a critical problem that affects millions of people around the world." That evening, in the hotel room that Pete couldn't realistically afford but had reserved anyway, he placed a call to Sarah that carried the weight of everything they had invested in this moment. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying both concern and anticipation. "Absolutely terrified," Pete admitted without hesitation. "If we don't place in the top 3 categories, the licensing agreement disappears completely, and I've mortgaged our entire future for nothing more than an expensive lesson in the risks of believing in teenagers." "Pete, even if the worst-case scenario happens, what you've accomplished with these students is genuinely remarkable. They've become different people over the past year, more confident, more capable, more ambitious than they ever thought possible. But Sarah, the financial reality, the money will work itself out somehow, one way or another. What you've given these students, confidence in their abilities, advanced skills, the knowledge that adults can believe in their potential, that's invaluable regardless of what happens tomorrow. Saturday brought an endless parade of preliminary judges, graduate students, industry professionals, and retired scientists who would evaluate projects and narrow the field before final judging on Sunday. Pete observed his students present their work with remarkable poise and expertise that amazed not only him, but clearly impressed the evaluators. They fielded complex technical questions with confidence, explained sophisticated chemistry concepts with clarity, and demonstrated genuine passion for their work that was impossible to fake. But the competition was undeniably fierce. The project immediately adjacent to theirs, developed by students from an elite preparatory academy in Ann Arbor, involved artificial intelligence applications in environmental monitoring, backed by a formal partnership with Google's research division. Another nearby project focused on revolutionary renewable energy storage and had been developed with direct support from Tesla's engineering team. "Mr. Rose, I'm genuinely scared," Marcus confided during a brief break between presentations. "These other students have access to resources we never could have imagined. What if we're simply not competitive at this level?" Pete looked at this remarkable young man who had transformed from a potential high school dropout into a sophisticated researcher over the course of just 8 months. "Marcus, let me tell you something I've learned after 30 years of teaching. The students who accomplish the most remarkable things aren't necessarily the ones with the most advantages. They're the ones who care the most deeply about what they're doing and who are willing to work the hardest to achieve their goals. But look at their equipment, their professional presentations, their corporate sponsorships. And look at what you've accomplished, starting with nothing but curiosity and determination. You've developed a water filtration system that outperforms technologies developed by major corporations. You've done original research that impressed professional engineers. You've learned graduate-level chemistry concepts that most college students never master. Sunday morning arrived with a mixture of anticipation and dread that Pete recognized from his early days of teaching, when everything felt like it carried life or death significance. The final judging would begin at 9 a.m. with presentations to a panel of 5 judges, 2 university professors, 2 industry professionals, and 1 retired scientist who served as the panel coordinator. Pete's students had practiced their presentation dozens of times, but he could see the nervous energy radiating from all 3 as they made final adjustments to their display. Their filtration system gleamed under the exhibition lights, every component precisely positioned, every connection verified and tested. "Remember," Pete told them as the judges began their rounds, "you're not just presenting a science project. You're presenting a solution to a problem that affects your community, your families, your lives. That authenticity and passion will come through regardless of what questions they ask." When the judges arrived at their station, Pete felt his heart rate accelerate to what felt like dangerous levels. The lead judge, Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Michigan, examined their display with the methodical attention of someone who had evaluated thousands of student projects. "Tell us about your water purification system," she said simply. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus, Keisha, and Tony delivered the most sophisticated scientific presentation Pete had ever witnessed from high school students. They explained the chemistry behind their filtration process, demonstrated the system's operation with live water samples, presented detailed performance data, and discussed potential applications with the confidence of professional researchers. "What inspired you to work on this particular problem?" asked Dr. James Foster, one of the industry judges. "We live in Detroit," Keisha replied simply. "Water contamination isn't an abstract concept for us. It's our daily reality. We wanted to develop something that could actually help our community and communities like ours around the world." "And what have you learned through this process?" asked Dr. Williams. "We've learned that we're capable of much more than we ever thought possible," Marcus answered. "We've learned that real science isn't about memorizing facts. It's about asking important questions and working persistently to find answers. We've also learned that with the right support and encouragement, students from any background can accomplish extraordinary things," Tony added, glancing meaningfully at Pete. The judges spent another 10 minutes examining their prototype, testing their water samples, and reviewing their documentation with professional thoroughness. When they finally moved on to the next project, Pete felt completely drained, as if he had just completed the most important examination of his life. The awards ceremony was scheduled for Sunday evening, with results announced in reverse order of significance. Pete sat with his students in the convention center's main auditorium, surrounded by hundreds of other participants and families, listening as third-place awards were announced for various categories. Third place in environmental science goes to, Pete held his breath, the Advanced Water Recycling Project from Birmingham Preparatory Academy. Pete felt a mixture of relief and growing anxiety. They hadn't placed third, which meant they either hadn't placed at all or they had achieved something better. Second place in environmental science goes to, another pause that felt eternal, the solar-powered air purification system from East Lansing High School. Pete's heart was pounding so hard he was certain the people around him could hear it. Keisha reached over and grabbed his hand, her palm damp with nervous perspiration. And first place in environmental science, which also receives recognition as this year's overall state championship project, goes to... The silence stretched until Pete thought he might lose consciousness from the suspense. The Community Water Purification System from Lincoln High School in Detroit. The explosion of sound that followed seemed to come from very far away. Pete saw his students leap from their chairs, embracing each other and crying with joy and relief. He felt people patting his back, heard congratulations being offered, but everything seemed muffled and distant as the reality of their achievements slowly penetrated his consciousness. They had won. Not just placed, but won the entire competition. As they made their way to the stage to accept their award, Pete caught sight of Dr. Chen in the audience, smiling broadly and applauding enthusiastically. The licensing agreement was secure, the scholarship offers were guaranteed, and most importantly, 3 remarkable young people had proven to themselves and the world that they belonged among the finest student scientists in the state. That evening, as they drove back to Detroit with their first-place trophy safely secured in the trunk, Marcus spoke for all of them. "Mr. Rose, we know what you risked for us. We know you bet everything you owned on 3 kids that most people had written off. We want you to know that we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to be worthy of that belief." Pete looked at these 3 extraordinary young people who had become like his own children, who had taught him as much as he had taught them, who had reminded him why he had become a teacher in the first place. "You already are worthy," he replied. "You've always been worthy. You just needed someone to give you the chance to prove it." As the Detroit skyline came into view, Pete realized that regardless of the money, the recognition, or the opportunities that lay ahead, the most important victory had already been achieved. 3 young people had discovered their own potential, and a teacher had remembered the transformative power of believing in students' dreams. The rest was just the beginning.